So, the breaking news tonight is that Buckingham Palace has finally confirmed what much of London has been quietly whispering about for weeks. King Charles is stepping back from his public responsibilities, and the balance of power inside the palace is moving toward Prince William and Catherine. But that isn't the detail that has everyone talking. The real shock is a handwritten sentence hidden near the bottom of the succession order, a sentence that effectively blocked Camilla from taking part in the monarchy's decision-making process entirely. And according to what we're hearing, she didn't discover what had happened until the document had already been signed, sealed and finalized. If you've been following the royal family, you know Charles has spent months trying to maintain an image of stability. We saw those carefully arranged photographs of him working behind his desk, the official statements insisting that he was continuing with his red boxes, and the repeated assurances that his cancer treatment had not prevented him from carrying out his responsibilities. But behind the scenes, the situation was apparently very different. Meetings were postponed, ceremonies were shortened, and Prince William was quietly taking on more and more of the king's public schedule. What we're learning now is that the real breaking point reportedly came during a rehearsal for a major state ceremony in London. Charles arrived determined to complete it, but witnesses claim he simply could not maintain the pace. The color reportedly disappeared from his face. His answers became increasingly brief, and his concentration appeared to drift. Eventually, the room was cleared and his doctors were called. Their message was direct. If Charles continued forcing himself through the schedule, he could jeopardize the progress he had already made. He needed to surrender a significant portion of his responsibilities immediately and prepare for a much longer absence than anyone had publicly acknowledged. That led to an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small group of constitutional advisors were summoned without being told exactly why. Before we get into what allegedly happened inside that room, I have to ask you something. Are you happy that Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if you believe Camilla has maintained far too much palace influence for far too long, don't just watch this story in silence. Like this video and subscribe to Crown Watch, because what happens next could become even more dramatic. So, the group was gathered around the table when a sealed folder was placed directly in the center. Its title was simple: The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. At first, William assumed it concerned nothing more than several cancelled engagements. Catherine believed it was probably a temporary adjustment, but then Charles opened the document and explained what it actually contained. The order would transfer state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term direction of the monarchy directly to William. Then Charles turned toward Catherine. Under the new arrangement, she would take on responsibilities normally associated with the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial appearances, and the public program of the royal household. Catherine didn't answer immediately, and honestly, it is easy to understand why. Accepting responsibilities of that scale would change the way the public interpreted almost every appearance she made afterward. Supporting her husband was one thing. Stepping into a role that made her appear like the queen in waiting was something completely different. William also pushed back. He told Charles that people could interpret the move as though he had pressured his father into stepping aside. It could look like ambition instead of necessity, but Charles remained firm. He said the decision was his, and that protecting the monarchy could not mean pretending that his physical strength had remained unchanged. He wanted to make sure neither William nor Catherine carried the blame. But then the atmosphere inside the room changed. Before the discussion could continue, Princess Anne placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes connected to members of Camilla's household. These were not ordinary correspondence or casual internal messages. They described plans for how Camilla's office could preserve influence if Charles withdrew from public duties. The proposals touched ceremonies, appointments, palace scheduling, and the royal public program. William read the first page twice. Catherine remained completely still. The implications were difficult to ignore. While Charles was struggling to maintain his workload, Camilla's household appeared to have already been discussing ways to preserve its influence, and neither William nor Catherine had been included in those conversations. Charles had not authorized them, and according to the papers, he discovered the discussions before the proposal could move any further. The language was extremely careful. Nothing openly challenged the king. Nobody directly used the word power, but almost every sentence appeared to point toward the same objective. Camilla's office wanted to remain involved. The proposal described an advisory arrangement based at Clarence House. It would allow Camilla's household to review ceremonial plans, suggest changes to the royal diary, and maintain involvement in state banquets and official appearances. One paragraph reportedly suggested that William's expanded authority should be described as temporary, even if Charles remained away for several months. That sentence changed the mood of the entire room. William asked who had written it. Anne turned to another page and pointed toward a list of names. Senior members of Camilla's office, private secretaries, household advisors. Charles read the names silently. He had not approved the meeting. He had not requested the proposal, and he had certainly not been informed that members of his wife's household were already discussing how to preserve influence during his absence. Catherine's eyes moved toward the margins of the document. There were handwritten notes beside several proposals. One recommended that major ceremonial decisions require consultation with the Queen's office. Another warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the only centre of authority while Charles recovered. The message beneath all that polished palace language was impossible to miss. William could carry the responsibility, but Camilla's office appeared determined to keep a hand on the controls. Anne explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide became uncomfortable with the discussions. The concern had been presented using familiar palace language: continuity, experience, stability. Palace language can make almost anything sound harmless. Charles closed the folder. Then he asked the question everyone else was thinking. Did Camilla know about this? Anne said the discussions had occurred through her household, but the documents did not establish exactly how much Camilla herself had personally approved. William immediately looked toward the door, prepared to confront her. Charles stopped him. This could not become a confrontation in the corridor, he said, not with staff moving throughout the palace and reporters watching every change in the royal schedule. Camilla would be called in privately and given an opportunity to explain. The meeting paused for 20 minutes. William walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His anger had not disappeared. It had become colder and more controlled. Catherine followed him and reminded him that the papers were dangerous precisely because they sounded reasonable. A public accusation would give Camilla's office an opportunity to deny everything and portray William as someone impatient to inherit the crown. William understood. That made the situation even more complicated. When Camilla eventually entered the room, Charles was seated at the head of the table. The folder remained closed in front of him. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat opposite the chair prepared for Camilla. Nobody raised their voice. The silence said enough. Charles asked her directly whether members of her household had discussed creating an advisory council from Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla paused. She said responsible members of her staff had considered several possible arrangements. She described the discussions as preparation, not ambition. Her argument was that a monarchy facing uncertainty could not simply throw away experience. She had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, ceremonial machinery, and personalities within the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision, she argued, would not create stability. It would create disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. Camilla proposed a formal position that would allow her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the royal public program. William could manage constitutional matters, Catherine could represent the crown alongside him, but Camilla's household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were involved. On the surface, it sounded like a compromise. It wasn't. Catherine asked one question. Who would make the final decision if William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla replied that Charles's wishes should guide them. But that was exactly the problem. Charles's absence was the reason the arrangement existed in the first place. Yet Camilla's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would return through phone calls, competing instructions, requests for clarification, and appeals for intervention. William opened the folder again and pushed one page toward Charles. The document described William's authority as reversible. That single word ended the discussion. Charles told Camilla that he would not approve any amendment that weakened the heir's authority or created a competing court inside the monarchy. Camilla's expression changed. She turned toward William and asked whether this was what he wanted. William answered that he had not written the order. Charles had. Camilla left without accepting the decision. The door closed quietly behind her, but nobody inside the room believed the conflict was finished. Charles then turned toward the constitutional advisor and asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor looked down at the final page. There was one way to make sure they could not. He explained that a transfer of duties could potentially be challenged through interpretation. A household could claim consultation rights. An aide could delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those actions would necessarily overturn William's authority. But each could slow it. Each could weaken it. And each could force Charles back into the very struggle he was trying to escape. Charles understood the problem. This was no longer simply about whether William could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be able to obstruct him while claiming to protect the crown. William moved away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. He told Charles that he would not accept authority built on public humiliation. He did not want to appear before the country as though his father's illness had become an opportunity. If the announcement happened, it needed to preserve Charles's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping back, he said, was not surrender. It was a decision made before weakness allowed other people to make it for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented. Her concern was clarity. The country could not be shown one arrangement while the palace quietly operated under another. If William was expected to lead, the public program needed to reflect that. If Catherine was expected to assume the visible ceremonial responsibilities, no private household should be able to quietly reverse her decisions. Everyone watched Charles closely. He had spent years balancing affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every possible compromise led back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing beside him. William needed clear authority as heir. Catherine needed protection from accusations that she had taken something that did not belong to her. The monarchy needed one clear voice. Only one of those priorities could control the order. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses that granted consultation rights to the Queen's household were removed. State audiences would pass directly to William. Senior palace appointments would require his approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the royal household's public program. She would be the bridge, not the ruler, not the rival. The public face standing alongside William. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than anyone expected. The answers became less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement could not remain temporary forever, simply because nobody wanted to name what might come next. The crown could not exist permanently inside a pause. Charles finally reached the last page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it was the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected his father to sign. Catherine expected another delay. Then she noticed Charles's hand move away from the signature and toward the blank space underneath the final clause. He began writing slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household. That one sentence changed everything. William read it once. Then again, the order was no longer simply a medical arrangement. It had become a barrier. Charles had not merely transferred responsibility to his son. He had deliberately prevented the household most likely to challenge that responsibility from creating an alternative route back into palace decisions. Catherine looked toward Anne. Anne gave no visible reaction, but her silence suggested that she understood the importance of what had just happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. That mattered. Typed language could later be blamed on advisors. Legal wording could be dismissed as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king was much harder to describe as an administrative mistake. Charles signed beneath it. Anne signed as witness. William placed his hand on the document but did not immediately pick it up. For several seconds, father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, both aware that the paper between them had changed far more than the royal diary. It had changed where power sat. A secretary entered the room, sealed the copies, and asked where the first copy should be delivered. Charles answered immediately. Clarence House. Camilla received it before the public announcement had even been drafted. She turned through the pages. Then she reached the handwritten sentence and stopped. She called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace was over. The struggle over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's advisors expected anger. Instead, they saw control. She placed the document on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. Nobody spoke. The wording was too direct. There was no obvious room for negotiation, no quiet path back into palace decisions, and no realistic way to argue that William's authority remained dependent on Camilla's approval. Camilla asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor answered carefully. The king had written it himself. The royal seal had already been applied. Anne had witnessed the signature. Any change would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla understood the difficulty immediately. Charles had closed the door before she could reach it. A private secretary suggested that she appear beside Charles anyway. A united image, he argued, could preserve some of the influence that the document had removed. Camilla rejected the suggestion. Standing beneath palace cameras, while William and Catherine were introduced as the new center of royal life, would look like acceptance. Worse, it would make her appear to be witnessing her own exclusion. She would not give them that image. Across London, Buckingham Palace began moving unusually quickly. Communications officials prepared the statement. Ceremonial staff measured positions in the throne room. Security teams revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the country about the future conduct of royal duties. The wording was carefully constructed. Charles was not abdicating. William was not becoming king. Catherine was not being declared queen. And yet every practical detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible weight of the crown was moving with it. Charles insisted on appearing first. Advisors wanted the announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak on his behalf. He would face the cameras himself. He would explain the decision, and he would make clear that William had not demanded it. That detail mattered deeply to him. William had spent years preparing to inherit the crown. Preparation, however, was not the same as desire. Charles understood how quickly the public could transform duty into ambition. One photograph of William standing too close to the throne, one poorly chosen sentence, or one suggestion that Catherine looked too comfortable could turn the transition into a story about a family takeover. So Charles would accept the responsibility. He approved a short address explaining that his recovery required him to reduce his workload. He would confirm that William was taking responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would identify Catherine as the person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the royal household's public program. Then he added a sentence the advisors had not prepared. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. Nobody asked him to remove it. At Clarence's house, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left blank. A place remained available near Charles during the opening statement, but no official role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision-maker. That distinction hurt more than any public criticism could have been. Camilla sent one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked whether Charles would reconsider the restriction on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order remained exactly as signed. Camilla cancelled her car outside Buckingham Palace. Broadcasters began live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms throughout the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by Anne, then William and Catherine. Camilla was absent. Rumours spread immediately. Some people claimed she was unwell. Others suggested there had been a private disagreement. Palace officials repeated the same phrase, "A family matter." Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order beside him. William arrived first. Catherine followed. Anne stood near the window, watching the courtyard filled with cameras. Charles looked exhausted, but his voice remained steady. He told William that the announcement would alter how the public understood their relationship. From that moment onward, every decision would be examined for evidence of conflict. Every absence would become a theory. Every appearance would be interpreted as a message. William said he would honor the reign Charles had already begun. Catherine remained silent. She was looking toward the two ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One carried William's place. The other carried hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed that Camilla would not attend. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Then he gave the order to begin. The cameras went live. The palace doors opened, and before Charles had spoken a single word, Britain could already see who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to remain away. Charles entered the prepared room alone. For several seconds, he stood behind the lectern without speaking. The cameras captured the strain around his eyes. No official statement could completely hide it. He looked determined, but the effort required to remain there was obvious. Then he began. He told the country that duty sometimes required a person to understand the difference between endurance and genuine service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose the institution to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily demands of the crown, and the monarchy needed leadership capable of acting without hesitation. Then he named William. The words were carefully measured, but their meaning travelled immediately through London, Westminster, and newsrooms across the country. William would take responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-term direction of the royal household. The arrangement would begin immediately. Then Charles named Catherine. She would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. Her role would not be symbolic. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to demonstrate who was now carrying its public burden. The room remained silent. Charles did not mention Camilla. That omission was more powerful than any direct criticism could have been. He thanked those who had supported him during treatment. He spoke about continuity, family, and the future. But the woman who had stood beside him throughout his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of responsibility. At Clarence's house, Camilla watched the address with two members of her staff. She did not react when William's name was announced. She remained still when Catherine's new responsibilities were described. Only when Charles finished without naming any continuing decision-making role for her did she reach for the copy of the order again. The handwritten sentence remained beside the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The emotion of the moment was carefully controlled, but it was not absent. Charles placed one hand on William's arm and released it quickly, almost as though holding on for another second might reveal more than either man wanted the cameras to see. Catherine joined them moments later. She wore no crown, no tiara, nothing that suggested celebration. Her expression carried the seriousness of the decision more clearly than any speech. Anne watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments transformed into pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no triumphant music, no sense of victory, only a family attempting to turn a private crisis into a public image of stability. Then Charles left. The cameras remained. William and Catherine turned toward the throne room, where two ceremonial chairs had been placed beneath the royal insignia. They walked together slowly enough for broadcasters across Britain to capture the image. The symbolism was immediate. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that would be extremely difficult to reverse. William stopped before the first chair. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat immediately. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, fully aware that the country was watching them assume responsibility before it watched them assume a new monarchy. Then William took his place. Catherine followed. The images spread across television screens and phones within minutes. Commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional boundary. Supporters described the move as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the arrangement could truly be when the ceremony itself presented William and Catherine as the monarchy's new center. One question dominated almost every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials continued repeating that her absence involved a private family matter, but the explanation satisfied almost nobody. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already learned that her car had been cancelled before the address. Others discovered that no future ceremonial role for her appeared in the public briefing. The explanation was beginning to fall apart. Inside Clarence's house, Camilla ordered the television switched off. She had expected Charles to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible before the entire country. And she certainly had not expected Catherine to take on responsibilities Camilla believed should remain connected to her own position. Her title had not disappeared. Her household had not disappeared. Her influence had. After the cameras were gone, a private secretary handed William the signed order instead of the public copy. William examined the final page. Then he noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten restriction directly above the royal seal. Anyone trying to challenge William would have to pass that sentence before reaching the king's signature. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the central point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had left. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside the building, the atmosphere felt almost empty of ceremony. Charles was waiting near the window. Catherine stood beside a table covered with briefing papers. Anne remained near the door, holding the second sealed folder that nobody had yet discussed. William placed the order in front of his father. He asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction really necessary? Charles did not answer immediately. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the single line that had transformed a medical arrangement into a firm boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had not explained. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload, but Camilla's private preparations had forced him to decide exactly where authority would stop. Without that sentence, every major decision could have become another negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned by Clarence's house. A state banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles intervened. The king could have stepped away publicly while continuing to settle disputes privately. That wasn't recovery. It was another form of captivity. Charles told William that he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could coexist with institutional uncertainty. This time there could be no blurred lines, no competing office, no second court operating through friendship, access, influence, or habit. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to change. His father had not written the restriction simply to embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he understood how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost in a quieter way. Charles had protected their authority, but by doing so, he had also exposed the fracture inside his own household. She told them that the sentence would probably be studied for years because it revealed the moment Charles stopped trying to satisfy everyone. As king, he had selected one clear line of command. As a husband, he had accepted the consequences. Anne eventually stepped away from the door. The discussion moved toward what would happen next. At Clarence's house, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained. Her staff remained. Her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained. But the machinery that had given those things political influence had moved somewhere else. Decisions would now leave William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. Appeals to Charles would no longer automatically reopen settled decisions. Camilla had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most, the ability to influence what happened next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine standing beneath the royal insignia had travelled throughout Britain. Supporters called it stability. Critics described it as a soft transfer of power. Palace officials accepted neither description. They repeated that Charles remained king and that the arrangement existed to protect continuity. But symbols often speak when official statements refuse to. 2 chairs had been prepared. 2 names had been announced. One household had been left outside the new decision-making structure. Charles asked William for one final promise. The transition could not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation. No deliberate humiliation. No attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but the promise came with a boundary. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. Catherine supported that position. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be allowed to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement, called clear, final. Then Anne placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait. Anne said no. The cover carried a short title, Queen's Household Privileges and Residences After the Transition. Inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using while Charles remained away from public duties. One page concerned Clarence's house. Another concerned Buckingham Palace. But the final page contained something even more serious. Beside Camilla's name was a handwritten note identifying the exact date her unrestricted access to certain palace spaces could end, and that authorization had reportedly been approved before the throne room announcement even began. Camilla had not seen it. William had not seen it. And when Anne opened that final page, even Charles appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. And that document, along with the single residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first, is where the next chapter of this extraordinary palace story begins.